Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give it a few minutes to fill the room here, if you can bear with us. Good afternoon again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give it another minute or two here to fill the room. Good afternoon again, everyone. Give it another 30 seconds here to fill the room up. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us once again for our monthly Friday webinar series. Today's webinar is on COVID-19 vaccines. My name is Brett Spatell. I'm the Vice President of Advancement here at the National Hemophilia Foundation. At any point during the webinar, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We have NHF staff members monitoring these questions, which we will pose to the panel after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to the community beginning on Monday, November 9th. I'd like to introduce Dr. Len Valentino, President and CEO of the National Hemophilia Foundation. Len, thanks for taking the time to join us, and I'll now turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Brett. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody joining us from around the world. Today, we're going to talk about the COVID-19 vaccines and what we've been happening. I just want to remind everybody sort of where we're at currently. So next slide, Brett. Just a disclaimer that what I'm going to present here are my own opinions and not necessarily reflective of those of the National Hemophilia Foundation or its board of directors. Next slide. So coronavirus is a common virus that causes infection in your nose, sinuses, and upper throat. Most coronaviruses aren't dangerous, and the name coronavirus comes, as you can see from the picture on the left-hand side, the crown that encircles the virus. And this is called the spike protein that forms this crown around the virus. Next slide. So there's multiple different coronaviruses. The one that we're most interested right now is the SARS-CoV-2. So currently, where the world is at is that we have 4.8 million cases worldwide. And this has resulted, as of November 4th, when we have the last complete data, over 1.23 million deaths worldwide. In the United States, there's almost 9.5 million cases and about 90,000 cases per day on average. And this has resulted in more than 233,000 deaths in the United States, and even more than that in Europe. So the pandemic is currently raging, and it's clear that strategies need to be invoked to combat the virus. Next slide. So this shows you the anatomy of the coronavirus, much like other viruses. There's a outer shell, and that outer shell in this case is composed of this spike protein. And that'll be important as we talk about the vaccines because many are directed against the spike protein. The spike protein is encased in the lipid membrane, and then within the core of the virus is the RNA that is what defines this virus. Next slide. So people ask when the pandemic will be over, and I think it depends quite a bit. But what's pretty clear to people is that there are certain issues that impact the severity of infection, and one of those is the degradation or senescence of the immune system. So that's the loss of the immune system, which appears to be one of the main determinants of serious or fatal infections to viral infections like the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but also to viruses like influenza. And as we talk through this presentation, there are several ways that we can support the immune system. The first is restricting exposure to the virus. And we all have known about this for a long time, and it's been emphasized the importance of social distancing, wearing masks, etc., for things that we can do to restrict exposure to the virus. And that is probably the most important measure. The second is providing reactive or treatments to reduce the viral load. And to date, we've not seen this be a terribly effective measure to decrease the severity or the symptoms of the disease. The third strategy is develop a vaccine to prevent or at least decrease the seriousness of the infection. And that'll be the topic of our discussion today. And the fourth is strengthening the immune system, either by identifying factors that contribute to the loss of function of the immune system or eliminating or reducing those issues that reduce our immune systems, and then also replacing the factors with immune strengthening factors. So, it's all about trying to stay healthy during this time. But we'll turn our attention to the vaccines, and that will really help us understand when this pandemic might be over. Next slide. So there's a number of different strategies in the pipeline that focus on those mechanisms that I just presented to you. And this slide that comes from the Millikan Institute talks about the different mechanisms that are currently being developed for treatment and prevention of the SARS-CoV-2 infection, COVID-19. So there's a number of vaccines that are in development, as well as antibody treatments that received a fair amount of publicity after the President of the United States received one of the monoclonal antibody treatments. There's also a number of antivirals that are in investigation, and many of these are drugs that are currently were currently being developed or used for other viral infections that are being repurposed. And then there's a number of other types of drugs that are being developed, as well as some really unique, never before done RNA-based mechanisms of treatment and prevention. Next slide. So how will we achieve immunity? And people frequently talk about herd immunity. And herd immunity is the resistance to the spread of an infectious disease within a population that's based on pre-existing immunity of a high proportion of individuals. Typically, this is around 90% of individuals have to be immune to achieve herd immunity. So how can we get to herd immunity? On the next slide, we'll show you one mechanism. Well, that's to actually have the natural infection. So we can have people get infected. If we can go back 2 slides, please. Back up one more. Thank you. So we can have natural infection occur, and this results in people getting sick. When we're sick, we know that there are some dangers associated with that. And as I said, in worldwide, there's more than 1.2 million deaths associated with this virus. So we don't think that this is a terribly effective way to achieve herd immunity. It may also not result in long-term immunity. We don't have the data yet to demonstrate that having the natural infection results in long-living immunity to the virus, in contrast to what some people are talking about. On the next slide, we'll see the other mechanism to achieve herd immunity. Next slide. And that's by vaccination or immunization. And this is what we'll focus on today. Next slide. So what are the risks of natural infection? So we already talked about that we don't want to see this be the case. Well, why is that? So this is a study that was recently published in May of this year that looks at the number of deaths in the United States in a specified period of time between March 1st and May 30th, 2020. And let me take you through this figure for a moment. So the black line at the top demonstrates the actual number of deaths that were recorded in the United States between May 1st and May 30th. The dotted line at the bottom demonstrates the expected number of deaths. So you can see that the actual number of deaths is considerably greater than what was expected based on historical information for the same time of the year in over the last 10 years of reporting. So it's a substantial data set to compare to. So the actual number of deaths is considerably higher than what was expected. Now, the gold line in the middle are the number of deaths that are reported due to COVID-19. So although has been relayed in the lay press and by others, you may have heard on television or on other social media, the number of COVID-19 deaths is clearly not being overreported. Next slide. And what you can see is the difference between the expected number of deaths on the bottom, the dotted line, and the gold line in the middle would be the number of deaths that are attributable to COVID-19. And then we can see that the actual number of deaths is even higher. So there's an excess of deaths associated with COVID-19 in this pandemic than even what we're currently reporting by death records. Next. So what is a vaccine? Vaccines are injections or shots of or liquids, pills, or nasal sprays that can teach your body's immune system to recognize and defend against harmful germs or infections. They protect us from serious and sometimes deadly diseases. So this would be something like tetanus or measles or mumps or rubella. Vaccines contain germs or part of the germs that cause the disease, and they stimulate the immune response of the individual that helps your body fight off the germs. Your immune system will also remember the germ and attack it if that germ ever invades your body again. So this is a very important point to recognize because we want to have that immune system have a long memory. We don't want this to just last for a few months or even for a couple years. We want that to be available to fight the germ or the infection long into the future. This protection against a certain disease is called immunity. So we want our immunity to be lifelong. So one might ask the question, well, why do we need to get vaccines over and over? Well, that's not necessarily the case for something like tetanus or measles, where you get a vaccine, and in the case of tetanus, the immunity lasts for at least 10 years. And if you have other vaccinations like measles or rubella, that might be a much longer period of immunity against those types of infections. Well, on the other hand, you say, well, I have to get a flu shot every year. Why is that the case? Well, that's not because the immune system loses its function. It's because the virus mutates and the new virus occurs on a regular basis with influenza. And therefore, the influenza vaccines are based on the new mutations that are occurring in the community. And usually where we in the United States or the Northern Hemisphere look for this information is from our friends and neighbors in the Southern Hemisphere, in Australia and Brazil and all Southern Hemisphere countries. The United States monitors those types of infections along with the World Health Organization to be able to determine the strains of influenza that are currently occurring in the Southern Hemisphere and then develop vaccines against them to be used in the Northern Hemisphere and vice versa. So we want to have long-lasting immunity, in this case, to the COVID-19 coronavirus. Next slide. So how does a vaccine work? As I said, a vaccine usually contains a weakened or killed form of the disease-causing agent. In this case, it would be the coronavirus that causes COVID-19. That's typically injected into the body, Your body then recognizes this as a foreign invader and creates antibodies to fight the germs. Not only does it form antibodies, but something in your body called T cells can also react to that the form of the virus that's injected into your body. And those T cells provide long-lived immunity against that virus. So that if the actual disease or germ ever attacks your body again, the antibodies and also the T cells will become activated and destroy the virus and protect you from getting sick. That's how most vaccines work. Next slide. So what are the opportunities to develop a vaccine? So how do we do this? So in the case of vaccines, as I mentioned, like measles, mumps, rubella, smallpox, and chickenpox, we used attenuated forms of the live virus. So what does that mean? Those are weakened forms of the virus. These are live viruses. So this is why we tell people who may have a family member or themselves may have cancer or another immune disease that weakens their immunity substantially, not to receive live attenuated vaccines, because these can actually cause disease in people with a weakened immune system. Now, the situation is somewhat different with influenza and rabies virus and hepatitis A. These are inactivated virus, or what we call killed vaccines. These cannot cause disease in the individual, but they can induce the immune system to provide that protection that we talked about. And then there's a whole nother category of genetically engineered vaccines. And these are genetically engineered RNA or DNA with the instructions to make either the whole or more likely part of the virus. And once they do that, like making that spike protein that we talked about, then your body can react to that and form the antibodies and have the T cells also react so that you have long living immunity. So the live viruses on the top and the inactivated vaccines are strategies that have been traditionally used to create vaccines and are currently marketed around the world. Genetically engineered vaccines, those are something new. And that's an area that we don't have nearly as much experience with. Next slide. So the different vaccine platforms are shown here. The traditional vaccines on the left-hand side that we've talked about, and then the next generation vaccine platforms shown on the right. And these include technologies like adenovirus that can deliver either part or the entire virus machinery to the patient, or RNA vaccines or DNA vaccines that can be delivered. So these genetic platforms are ones that have not been tested very widely and are novel. So we're looking at both types of platforms, the conventional as well as these next generation platforms in COVID-19 vaccines. We'll talk more about those on the next slide. So Operation Warp Speed is something that you may have heard about. And the goal of Operation Warp Speed is to produce and deliver 300 million doses of safe and effective vaccines, with the initial doses available by January 2021. So this is a federal program that has received a fair amount of attention recently, part of a broader strategy to accelerate the development, manufacturing, and most importantly, distribution of a COVID-19 vaccine or vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, collectively known as countermeasures. So it's very important that we understand that Operation Warp Speed is not only about developing the vaccine and then manufacturing it, it's also about distribution of the vaccines. One of the challenges that we have in the United States is that we have a very clear mechanism in place to distribute vaccines to children. However, we don't have a similar mechanism that is developed to distribute vaccines to adults on a wide scale. And this is why Operation Warp Speed is so important. It's not only the development and manufacturing, it's about putting into place a distribution system to widely give the vaccine to adults. And we'll talk about those people in a few slides coming up. Next slide. So the vaccines in development are shown here. And this slide was made as of October 22nd. And you can see here that there's more than 100 vaccines in preclinical development. There's some that are in phase 1 or phase 2. And importantly, there's a number in phase 3. And an updated slide, I'll show you the current number in phase 3. But I want to point out that there are no marketed vaccines that are currently present and available to treat patients with COVID-19. Next slide. So these are the mechanisms of action that are being used. And you can see here that there's a number of vaccines with different types of therapies. The one that's on the bottom, RNA or DNA, are ones that get a lot of publicity because they're focal points of Operation Warp Speed. The traditional vaccines are typically protein, combination, or subunit, those next three from the bottom. And you can see that there's almost 100 vaccines that are utilizing fairly conventional forms of vaccine development. There's 4 that are using a gene therapy. There's some that are involving the administration of the whole coronavirus, and others that are cellular therapies or small molecules. So there's multiple different shots on goal, so to speak, that are being explored to develop a vaccine for coronavirus. Next slide. So there's also something that I wanted to bring up, which is called the COVID-19 Prevention Network. And this is an initiative that's funded by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease and is coordinated by the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle. And its goal is to enroll volunteers into COVID-19 vaccine trials nationwide. So this is not specific to one drug developer or manufacturer or research program and COVID-19 vaccine, but it's really trying to be a national resource to pool volunteers together and then be able to rapidly get them into vaccine trials to move this forward. Next slide. So Operation Warp Speed and the COVID-19 Vaccine Network work in harmony and synergistically. So vaccine development pathway is much like other drug development pathway. There are phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials. Phase 1 trials are tested on a small number of people and look for safety, dosing, and efficacy. And these small scale trials are the first step in the development pathway. Phase 2 trials are expanded safety trials, and these typically involve hundreds of people in their trials. These first 2 phases in Operation Warp Speed have been cut short to try to hasten the development of these vaccines to get them to people as quickly as possible. Phase 3 trials are large scale trials that are now done in thousands or tens of thousands of people, with some receiving a placebo or, for example, a sugar cube to test the safety, dosage, and most importantly, the efficacy, as well as the side effects in a large population. Phase 3 trials typically take longer to conduct, again, because of the looking for safety signals as well as efficacy. Limited approval can occur in some countries based on the results of phase 3 trials. And then full authorization is when a country's regulators approve a vaccine based on the results of trials, and in some countries may authorize emergency use before the trials are complete when the efficacy is relatively clear, but we don't have a complete safety profile. Next slide. So where are we currently? So here's where the coronavirus vaccines in development are as of yesterday. 154 in preclinical development, 36 in phase 1, 14 in phase 2, and importantly, 11 in phase 3. There are 6 with limited use, none in the United States, however, and none have been approved worldwide. Next. So let's focus our attention now on the phase 3 trials. Again, the goal of a phase 3 trial is to test for safety, efficacy, and side effects. Next slide. So what I've put here are 5 of the largest and most well characterized phase 3 clinical trials for coronavirus vaccines to combat COVID-19. So the first one at the top is a collaboration between BioNTech and Pfizer to develop a vaccine. This program started in April of 2020 and is the furthest along and actually has generated some early data that I'll show you. It's currently a phase 2/3 trial that's enrolled almost 45,000 people in the United States, so a substantial number of people. The Moderna trial is a study that's looking at an mRNA vaccine, again, one of these novel mechanisms of action. And this study, which started in July, is enrolling 30,000 subjects in the United States. The third one, which is a vaccine that's in co-development by the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca, started on August 17th and is enrolling 30,000 people in the United States. The fourth one is an adenoviral vaccine trial sponsored by Johnson & Johnson and Janssen. And again, this is enrolling 60,000 people in the United States into a phase 3 trial. This program started their phase 3 trial on September 5th of 2020. And then the most recent trial is a trial by Novavax, a Maryland-based company in the United States, that's starting a phase 3 trial later in November and is scheduled to enroll over 30,000 subjects. So you can see that there's a large number of people being involved in these clinical trials. Almost 200,000 people will be testing these vaccines in the United States. Next slide. So what are the challenges with any of these vaccine trials? Of course, the most important is ensuring vaccine safety. We must ensure that we have a safe vaccine that is not going to cause harm to people. The second is provide long-term protection. As I said, we want to ensure that both the antibody response and T-cell immune response is long-lasting. To date, we have not seen that this virus is mutating at a rapid pace, unlike the influenza virus, which appears to mutate on a regular basis, and different vaccines are needed year to year. The coronavirus causing COVID-19 does not seem to have this same predilection for mutation. But again, we'll need more research to definitively demonstrate that moving forward. Another challenge is protecting older people. Why is that the case? Well, as I said in my introductory comments, immune senescence, or the loss of the immune system potency, is something that happens with age. And we see a significant change in immune response after age 65 years. So older people over the age of 65 have a compromised immune system by virtue of age. There's also a reduction in immune response in people who have pre-existing comorbidities or other diseases like heart disease or diabetes or asthma, where they can have immune challenges as well. People who are taking immune modulating or immune suppressive drugs that might be drugs that are used to treat people who have lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. Those are also drugs that can reduce the immune response to a vaccine. And then another major challenge is equitable allocation of vaccine. And we'll talk a bit about that in the subsequent slides. Next slide. So there are some ethical principles that were laid out by a group from the National Academy of Medicine that looked at a framework for equitable allocation of the COVID-19 vaccine. And these ethical principles were based on achieving maximal benefit to protect and promote public health, equal concern, equal dignity, worth, and value of individuals, and then mitigation of health inequities. So focusing on populations most heavily impacted. So these are the equitable principles that the National Academies of Medicine laid out for vaccine dispersion. Next slide. They focused on a risk-based set of criteria. The risk of acquiring the infection based on job or age, or we'll talk about that in a few minutes, and where you live or how you live. The risk of severe morbidity or mortality, something like age or coexisting diseases or comorbidities. The risk of a negative societal impact. What if all the medical healthcare professionals were infected and succumbed to the infection? That would certainly be a negative societal impact. And the risk of transmitting the infection to others. So people who are in frontline workers that are in contact with others on a regular basis. So their criteria was based on these 4 principles. Next slide. So in what they proposed was a multi-phased approach to delivering the vaccine. In phase 1A, high-risk healthcare workers would be the first to be vaccinated. Why is that the case? Because that has a great societal impact. We need to ensure that we have healthcare workers to take care of people who are sick, that we have healthcare workers to administer the vaccines to other people. Phase 1B is to administer the vaccine to people with 2 or more comorbidities. Those people who have hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease all at once, for example, or elderly people. Older adults who live in overcrowded settings is also another very important component because they're at high risk to contract the illness. So this would be phase 1 of the vaccine dispersion as proposed by the National Academies of Medicine. On the next slide, we see what phase 2 looks like. This would be vaccinating teachers, K through 12 teachers, as well as school staff, child care workers, critical workers in high risk settings, like other people who work in hospitals or medical centers, people with comorbid conditions, but not 2 or more. So it would be somebody who has type 2 diabetes, but is otherwise healthy, for example. People in confined settings. This could be people who live in residential settings, nursing homes that are not elderly, or are incarcerated in prisons. And then all older adults is phase 2. Next slide. Phase 3 includes vaccination of young adults between the ages of 18 and 30, all children, workers in industries important to societal functioning. And then phase 4 would be everyone else who's not in one of the other groups. Now, I do want to make one point about phase 3. So our vaccines that are currently in clinical development and being tested are being tested in adults. None of these trials are including children. So if we were to have a COVID-19 vaccine, it would be approved based on information only from adults. And we would be vaccinating children without any evidence of its safety or efficacy in those children. So we definitely need to advocate for having these vaccines tested in children as quickly as possible once we have evidence of their safety in adults. Next slide. So how much has the federal government invested in COVID-19 vaccines as part of Operation Warpspeed? So over $2.5 billion has been earmarked for vials to store the vaccines for syringes to deliver them, and for efforts to ramp up manufacturing and capacity. So Operation Warp Speed has been a tremendous investment in our future to combat COVID-19. And I put some of the amounts of money that have been invested by the government to support the development and manufacturing of these vaccines through various different companies, as you can see on the slide. But I think it's really important to recognize that the greatest proportion of dollars spent has been to develop an infrastructure around storage of vaccines and the delivery of vaccines, as well as manufacturing and capacity. Next slide. So do vaccines cause side effects? This is something that we're all concerned about. And I think it's important to recognize that any vaccine can cause side effects. Any medication can cause side effects. We don't understand all of the issues around those side effects. I think one thing that's important to recognize is that there may be more severe side effects to vaccines based on comorbid conditions, heart disease, diabetes, or asthma. And there's some evidence that's coming around to show that, especially information from influenza vaccines as well. Most of the time, the side effects are minor, such as a sore arm where the injection is administered, or fatigue or mild fever, and they usually go away within a few days. These common side effects are often a sign that your body is starting to build immunity against a disease as well. Next slide. This is one study of the one vaccine trial that reported their local number of reactions. And this was the data from the Pfizer vaccine trial that I showed you that started back in April. And you can see here that there were a number of mild side effects reported in this study, but importantly, there were only rare severe side effects, and none of them were grade 4 or life-threatening side effects. So the safety profile of at least this first vaccine seems to be very acceptable and is proceeding to now look very diligently at its efficacy in the population. Next slide. So the likelihood of a vaccine, would I receive a vaccine? So this was a poll that was conducted by CNN several times during 2020. And I want to show you the results from 3 snapshots in time. The question that was asked of people was, if a vaccine to prevent coronavirus infection were widely available at a low cost, would you personally try to get that vaccine or not? And back in May, you can see that about 2/3 of the people surveyed said that they would. In August, that number decreased to 56%. And as recently as October 1st to 4th, about half of the population said they would, and about another half either no or had no opinion. And this is not the right direction that we're going. We need to have more people feeling confident in our vaccines that are in development. Next slide. You can see that it's really important that we try to get to that 90% vaccination rate to achieve that herd immunity. If people aren't willing to get the vaccine, that's not going to be helpful to us as a population. So the question for the bleeding disorders community is, should I get the vaccine? And I point to the Medical and Scientific Advisory Council's recommendation that encourages people with bleeding disorders to first be included in COVID-19 vaccine trials. And this was a statement that was issued on August 8th of this year. And I think that the premise for this recommendation is that if the bleeding disorder that's intrinsic to the coagulopathy or clotting disorder that's intrinsic to COVID-19 contributes to the morbidity and mortality in infected people who have clinically apparent disease. So we know that COVID-19 can cause blood clots, can cause vascular disease as well. And having a coagulation disorder like a bleeding disorder greatly complicates the management of these patients, as a primary method of treatment of the coagulopathy is anticoagulation. So it's the giving of a blood thinner to people who already have a bleeding disorder. Becomes very complicated. So we would like to have people with bleeding disorders included in the vaccine trials. And similarly, if a vaccine were to be approved, it would be the recommendation more likely than not that they should be given the vaccine as one of those potentially vulnerable populations. And anticoagulation can be administered effectively in persons with bleeding disorders under appropriate supervision of a hemophilia treatment center. So it's very important that if you do participate in a COVID-19 vaccine trial, that you work with your hemophilia treatment center to make sure that they're aware of your participation. And as the vaccine becomes available for commercial or clinical use post-approval, it'll also be important for people with bleeding disorders to work with their hemophilia treatment center to safely and effectively receive the vaccines. So it'll be important for the bleeding disorders community to receive that vaccine so that we're not more vulnerable than others in terms of the infection. So next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and offer the opportunity for questions from the listeners.
Thanks, Len. We've had several questions come in. Actually, I'm going to start at the Q&A section. This one says, does phase 3 in children include infants?
So at this time, there are no phase 3 trials that are including children or infants. And I think that that will be something that the regulators, the Food and Drug Administration, will have to negotiate with the developers of these vaccines as to how they believe the safety of these trials can be rolled out to children or anybody under the age of 18, as well as children and infants. So I think that's an area that requires further exploration and input from the Food and Drug Administration, and in Europe from the European Medicines Agency.
Great. Another question that came in. Is it true that they are still having recruitment issues for COVID trials? And are people with bleeding disorders eligible for those?
So people with bleeding disorders are eligible, and as the MASAC recommendation points out, they should be included in those clinical trials. So I believe that there's only one phase 3 trial that currently has a specific exclusion criteria for somebody who has a bleeding disorder. Otherwise, I believe that the trials have remained silent on this, and therefore people with a bleeding disorder should be eligible to participate. I think the challenge there is, as you saw from the CNN study, is that less than half of the people are willing to take the vaccine. And this would be true for if it were commercially available, but I think it's probably also true for trials, that people are unwilling to participate in trials because of fear of the vaccine. So that's why that COVID-19 vaccination network is so important, so that appropriate people can be included in the trials. And I will say personally that I did enroll in that vaccine network. I have not been called, but I would definitely volunteer for a clinical trial if I was asked to participate.
Great. Thanks, Len. The questions continue to roll in here. Is there talk that vaccination for COVID-19 might be made mandatory in the U.S.?
I think that's a question. As far as I know, there is no mandatory requirement to take the vaccine, and I think that there still will be patient and individual choice that will be possible. Now, as a healthcare worker, there are ways that the vaccination can be distributed and ensure that people at the highest risk receive it. So for example, in many hospitals, healthcare workers or visitors cannot enter without having had an influenza vaccine. So that's one of the things. So during outbreaks, that's an important mechanism to get more and more people vaccinated. And I know that when I was working in the medical center, there would frequently be an opportunity for people who were entering the medical center who had not been vaccinated to stop at an area to get their vaccine up, before they would enter the medical center. And I think that although mandatory vaccine is unlikely, at least in my opinion, and I've not seen anything that from the government that would require mandatory vaccine. I think we have to be confident in our drug developers, our vaccine developers, to have first a safe and effective vaccine that can be widely distributed with minimal side effects.
Great. Another question came in, Len. Says, what about our community members who have HIV? And I'm assuming that means the safety of the vaccine for our members with HIV.
Yeah. So again, there's an issue where there is a weakened immune system, and I think that would be an individual discussion with your HIV specialist, your infectious disease specialist, or your hematologist. We understand that people with any immune deficiency, whether that's HIV or lupus or diabetes, those people are at increased risk for serious infection. But again, we want to make sure that they're also safely vaccinated or are protected. So I think that's going to be an area that we're going to need a lot more information on. Is there really has not been much discussion about these high risk vulnerable populations and how we can safely vaccinate people who currently have or recently have a history of cancer, for example. Again, if HIV is well controlled and the CD4 count is in an acceptable range, I suspect that those individuals will be able to receive the vaccine. It'll probably depend to some degree on the mechanism of action of the vaccine as well.
Great. Thanks, Len. The questions continue to roll in. We'll just go kind of rapid fire with you here. Can you talk about the transverse myelitis seen in one of the trials?
So, there are adverse events, no doubt, and there are going to be patterns that will emerge. To date, we have not seen additional serious neurological complications. But again, the numbers of people who've received these vaccines are not very large. And you saw that those trials involve, their goal is to enroll 30,000 or 40,000 or 60,000 individuals. Those people have not been exposed to the vaccine for long periods of time. So this could be an idiosyncratic, meaning that it's happenstance. But I think until we have more time that people have been exposed to these vaccines and we see patterns emerging, it'll be unclear as to whether that's something that we have to be concerned about or not. Again, and I think it's going to be incumbent on the Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency, as well as other regulatory authorities around the world, to monitor for the safety of these drugs, to ensure that our population is able to safely receive these medications.
Great. Thanks, Len. Next question is, what are the possible or potential foreseen risks with a genetically engineered vaccine versus an attenuated or inactivated vaccine?
Well, I think it's somewhat of a black box at this point. So the live virus and the attenuated virus strategies and protein vaccines have been around for decades, and those are mechanisms of action that are tried and true. They've been demonstrated to be safe and effective and can induce long-lasting immunity. These novel mechanisms of actions are ones that have not been tested and have not been used in large numbers of people. So the safety profile for these novel vaccine strategies is somewhat unclear. And I think we'll learn more as more people receive these vaccines and we have more time to examine the outcome for these individuals. But again, at this point, it's somewhat unknown.
Great. Thanks, Len. Next question. Is there a preliminary efficacy data from any of the vaccine trials to date?
So there has been some preliminary evidence, and I believe from Pfizer there has been some, but the results are very early, and they are promising. And obviously, all of these trials would need to have promising preliminary data to continue to proceed. And we've seen, a number of trials that have been stopped because they've not demonstrated efficacy. So some of them are vaccine trials outside of the United States, and some of the treatment trials have also been stopped for lack of efficacy. So I think it's an ongoing process by which we have to continue to monitor the safety and efficacy of these strategies to combat COVID-19.
Great. Next question is coming from a parent, Len. Says, is there any information on people with hemophilia with COVID-19 infection and their experiences, such as a comparison of seriousness of case with normal patients? Should people with hemophilia expect to be hospitalized when infected as a precaution or not?
Yeah, so I don't think that people with hemophilia are at any greater risk than the general population to acquire the infection, nor do we believe that they are at greater risk for serious complications or death if they do get the infection. So the answer to being hospitalized is not necessarily. I think it would be similar to what the general population, the recommendations for the general population. I do think that it's important to, again, do everything that you possibly can, whether you have a bleeding disorder or not, to restrict exposure to the virus. It's hand washing, it's wearing a mask, it's avoiding people who are sick. And if you're sick, staying home, sheltering in place, all of those things that we've heard for months and months and months are the things that are most effective in preventing this infection. And if you prevent the infection, you will prevent the seriousness of that infection. So it's really important that we do all of those things to prevent getting infected in the first place. So we don't believe that that's the case. But again, I will make a strong plea for everybody to participate in the Community Counts program through your hemophilia treatment center. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are working with our hemophilia treatment centers to collect information on the bleeding disorders community. And only through that collective effort will we have sufficient numbers of people enrolled to be able to see whether people with bleeding disorders are at an increased risk for infection or at an increased risk of serious complications or death if they do get infected. So again, I would strongly advocate for participation in the Community Counts program with your hemophilia treatment center.
Thanks, Linda. Questions continue to roll in here. Would hepatitis C be an area of concern for vaccination?
So it could be, and again, I think that's a discussion with your hepatologist, your infectious disease doctor, or your hemophilia treatment center physician. I don't believe that hepatitis C has been included as an exclusion factor for the vaccine trials, but again, it's an area that I'm not as familiar with. So I would definitely suggest seeking, the advice of your hemophilia treatment center physician or hepatologist.
Great. Next question. If adenovirus is used as a vector for COVID vaccine, how will that impact gene therapy for hemophilia that uses the same vector?
So that's actually not the case. So the vectors that are currently being used to deliver either factor 8 or factor 9 gene therapy to hemophilia A or B patients are adeno-associated viruses. These are not adenoviruses. Adenovirus is the common cold virus, very different than adeno-associated viruses. It's unfortunate that they share part of the same name, but they are not the same viruses, and there should be no impact of the adenoviral vaccine on people who are potentially candidates for hemophilia gene therapy.
Great. Next question, Len, is can you talk about immunity? If a person has already been infected with COVID, do they still need to be vaccinated?
Well, so we don't understand how long immunity lasts after natural infection. That remains an open question. We've seen from people who've participated in the convalescent serum studies that sometimes the antibodies wane after just a few weeks or months. But what we don't understand is the impact of the infection on the T cell response and whether those people have persistent T cell immunity. And I think we need to see more data in that area. So my guess is that we will see some recommendations that will come soon from not only the regulatory authorities, but from other academic researchers on the immunity after natural infection and whether a vaccine would be helpful or not to those individuals. But at this point, I have not seen that evidence to argue one way or the other.
Next question, Len, is with so many versions in development, could there be wide variability in efficacy, or would FDA only approve those with a clear threshold of success?
That would be a question that we'd have to ask the Food and Drug Administration. So I don't have an answer to that question.
Okay. Next question, is there any preliminary data yet about how long-lasting immunity obtained through experimental vaccines might be?
Yeah, again, no idea. Again, remember that these are people who were at the earliest vaccinated in April, May timeframe. So we've only got a few months of experience with these vaccines. So we have no clue about long-lasting immunity from either natural infection or from a vaccine.
Great, great. Len, we don't have any more answers in the queue, but I'll give you a minute to close it out if you'd like to, sir.
Yeah. So again, I think the vaccine trials are promising. It's really exciting to watch this field grow and develop. It's also really exciting to see the number of new mechanisms of action that are being put forward for COVID-19 vaccines. We believe that this will actually help in the vaccine development for other diseases as well. Many of the vaccines that we currently use and receive as patients are manufactured in eggs, and then those vaccines are actually harvested. To be able to use genetic technology to manufacture these vaccines is a tremendous advancement from what's frequently done to develop vaccines in the past. So it's exciting to see this, and I think it will help not only coronavirus, but the technologies will help other vaccine development as well. It's also really encouraging to see the collaboration between companies and the federal government moving forward. And again, we have to rely on the regulatory authorities to do the due diligence, to provide their sort of stamp of approval on the safety, efficacy, and long-term impact of these vaccines so that we can be confident in receiving the vaccines moving forward. And the last thing I'll say is, continue to protect yourself. It's important to try to avoid infections and restricting that exposure to the virus. Wash your hands, wear a mask, stay home if you're not feeling well, avoid anybody who is sick. It's those common sense things that we often overlook that are so critically important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Len. We'd appreciate it. I'd like to just take a minute to thank you. Having you as a resource here available to our community is really incredible. So we appreciate your time and expertise. I'd also like to thank each and every one of you for joining us. Please note that this recorded webinar will be available on Monday, November 19th in the COVID-19 section on hemophilia.org. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and we hope you have a wonderful weekend. Take care.